you. This is Marcus Shingles. He's the former CEO of the Xprize Foundation, which is one of the largest innovation foundations in the U.S., definitely in the U.S., but probably in the world. He's also an executive at Bain Company. And today he's going to be sharing some of his research that he's been doing in regards to supply chain management throughout his career, and how blockchain is changing that side of pretty much every industry. So, Marcus.
All right, thank you, Scott. Yeah. Hi, everybody. So let me, I don't really want to get into slideware and do a formal presentation. I'd rather just have a discussion and see if anyone also has any questions. I think it would be valuable to talk about a specific use case for Lexon and a capability similar to Lexon that would actually be adopted and needed by industry. So let me rephrase that a little bit, because I'm kind of more on the pragmatic side, meaning I have to implement this stuff. You know, my work at as a senior advisor to Bain, but also I was a partner at Deloitte Consulting, leading their innovation practice focused on new technologies. So I have to implement these capabilities. So I don't like to talk with clients about them too much and hype them up too much, unless there's actually a real business use case for them. And then I was a CEO of Xprize, which is a nonprofit. And so even on the nonprofit side, and I do a lot of work, currently I'm on the board of several educational nonprofits that focus on eradicating generational poverty by educating families in underserved communities. And I do a lot of work in that space. Almost half of my work week is focused on that, working with schools and other places. So whether it's in the nonprofit space or whether it's in the commercial space, the question is, to get excited about a capability, you have to actually start finding real use cases and where it's being applied, and where it's not a nice to have, but a need to have. So I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about that. There's quite a few areas with Lexon and decentralized architectures like blockchains. There's a lot of areas that it's promoted to apply, but I don't think it applies very well. I think that's a little bit of the hype curve. So I'd like to have more of a pragmatic discussion on just real examples of where this could be applied. And we'll talk about supply chain in particular, because I think that's a great example. Does anyone have any comments or questions? That's going to be the focus of the discussion. So if you've got some questions you'd like to posit right now, I can try to address them as well. I don't know if this group, how familiar you are with the commercial use or business application of these technologies, especially as I was asking Scott. Most of this group, I think that it's attending, is either on the engineering computer side or on the lawyer side. So I would not expect you to have much knowledge of business applications outside of your domain in which this applies. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Let me just pause for a second, see if anyone has any comments or questions. Cool. Okay. So let me share with you a little bit about the history of supply chains. This kind of stems back for me nearly 30 years now, when I worked at the Kellogg Company. It was one of my first jobs. I worked at a corporate position at Walmart, and then I worked at a corporate position at the Kellogg Company in Battle Creek, Michigan. And you know, Kellogg's had probably one of the more sophisticated supply chains in the world, just being a big global company. I was in the sales and marketing side of the organization, working with brands in the sales organization. I did the digital transformation to implement software to help the sales and marketing capability of the company, as well as quite a bit of decision support and business intelligence projects, data analytics projects, and some advanced analytics projects. Examples of that would be, you know, a company like Kellogg's wanted to know that if I lowered the price of a box of cereal by 10 cents, will it increase the demand for that product, or am I just giving away 10 more cents to a consumer without increasing demand? It's called price elasticity. So those are some of the examples of the advanced analytics that a company like that would do, even 30 years ago when it was a little bit more difficult to do that because you didn't have machine learning and other capabilities like you have today, or you didn't have big data. Um, but one of the challenges that any company has when it comes to supply chains is um, there's a lot of risk that you have to try to mitigate if you don't understand who's in your supply chain. And supply chains have gotten so complex in the last 30 years. Not only geography-based complexity, meaning you got product you're growing, you might be growing corn for cornflakes on the other side of the world that you're bringing to your factory, but you also have today issues with how you label your product and not sure if those labels are correct. So if you label something organic, if you label a product, as sourced safely without using slave labor or unfair work practices. So to be a responsible company, which I think most companies try to be, some of them don't try to be, they just do it because they don't want to be penalized with legal action or brand reputation issues. They put a lot of money into trying to figure out who are my partners in my supply chain and do I really know what what the proof of provenance of my product or raw goods is, whether I'm selling cereal and it's some food product grown on some farm, or whether I'm selling a shoe and I want to know where the leather came from, or whether I'm selling a computer and I want to know how the copper and uh, the steel and other things were mined from the mine. Um, you guys might recall just headlines over the years that have gotten corporates, big companies and brands really in trouble, for good reason too. I'm not making any excuse for corporates. I think they, when they get dinged, it's typically fair. But you remember Nike had a lot of issues. I think it probably dates 15 years now. They had a lot of issues where there was, reports that there was slave labor being used to make some of their source products. These were factories that Nike wasn't condoning that labor. It just didn't have visibility, and it's their responsibility to have visibility to understand who they're getting their supply from. But it's a very hard thing to understand and control for. And like I said, today it's even more so because supply chains are way more complicated because of the speed of distribution and logistics and shipping. Your ability to use labor from other countries is much more feasible because the cost to get that goods to you is not as nearly as expensive it used to be. Second, as I mentioned before, there's just a lot more consumerism consciousness where consumers are asking or demanding to be aware of what they're putting in their body, of course, from a food perspective, or where their products are coming from. Again, if something's labeled organic, is it really organic? If something's labeled healthy, or with, I don't know if you guys saw this, but I'm uh, I'm in Hawaii right now, uh, partly vacationing, partly working for I just had a big birthday, and I just saw that on the Hawaiian news. I don't know if this made national news, but Kona Coffee, Kona, Kona Coffee. There's a big news report how um, all these products were being labeled Kona Coffee, but they didn't have Kona coffee beans. So it was a big deal here because it was basically other coffee brands trying to act like they have this special particular Kona seed of coffee or bean, and they didn't. So that's a great example. It's like, how does a consumer really know? And there was a whole bunch of brands that were ripping off the Kona brand with that and labeling their product Kona coffee with Kona beans when they weren't. And so, some investigative reporter finally busted the whole thing open. It's been on the news here, but that's a good example. Like, how does a consumer really know? And so I would posit that it's not, there's a technology element to fix this, but there's a lot of really excellent centralized systems that have been proposed by the industry that from a technical perspective are great because they're just big global supply chain systems that can track who's doing what. But there's an issue with that, why they don't get adopted and why there's still a lot of issues. Does anyone want to guess, or maybe some of you are familiar with this industry? Do you know why these supply chain centralized systems over 2 decades have really proved to be definitely not 100% bulletproof, if not particularly useful, or why they've never gotten universal adoption? This is my attempt to make this participatory. Anyone? Bueller?
If I were to guess, I don't know much. I just saw the head of food safety over at Walmart back in the day. He was up on stage with John Cohn talking about their kind of dive into blockchain and supply chain management with the Food Health Network. And he said that over the past 2 decades or whatever, Walmart now has 75 million SKUs. Which is over 100 times. So what they used to have. So I would say it's probably, if I had to guess, scale. I mean, these things can only scale so much with traditional technologies, in my opinion. But I don't know. That's just a guess.
Thanks, Scott. Anyone else?
From my point of view, I think there's kind of two kind of things. So phoning up a company to do the kind of supply chain mapping that I've personally tried to do and been involved with, there's just this trust issue immediately. It's like they kind of want to say, yeah, we've got great suppliers everywhere, and yeah, we'll do this, but them actually giving you the detailed information of their suppliers, and worrying that how that data might get used by a competitor, or even just reflect badly on them. It's just like the incentives are not strong enough to overcome the worry about the risks of them sharing their data.
Ding, 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 ding. Yes, that's the right answer. That's so let me thank you, David, for that. Were you going to add something else? Sorry.
I think there's a big difference between a situation where you're a big, powerful actor and you dominate the supply chain and you can require your suppliers to do something they kind of don't want to do, from the potential of crowdsourcing investigation and getting an ecosystem of people, let's say in a cooperative movement or in some sort of space to both volunteer their own information and allow other people to audit them because they want to show off how kind of ethical they are. Those are very, very different scenarios. And so that difference between like, 1 or 2, 3 big players like Walmart demanding all their suppliers do something versus let's take an area like Whole Foods, and there's lots of independent suppliers, and what it's not a good example, but that difference between an ecosystem and a kind of hierarchical supply chain with the dominant player, I think the approaches are both different, and they're coming together at this point in history because you kind of need to combine the two to address the problem.
Yeah, that's brilliant, David. You're absolutely right. So let's break this down a little bit. There's a couple things at play here. One is the industry doesn't want to king make Walmart, right? If you have the power of being that a centralized system means someone's governing it, someone's, driving it. So the reason why you don't see a universal adoption of a system that Walmart decides to put out there is because people don't want to king make Walmart. Unilever doesn't want to king make Walmart. Kroger doesn't want to king make Walmart. Target doesn't want to king make Walmart. So if Walmart puts out a system and starts to mandate, you think Target's just going to say, let's use the Walmart system? No, they're going to say, no, we have a system out here and we're going to mandate it. So now you got to put your data in 2 places. It's going to get to be that type of thing. Second thing, Walmart did try this before, where you guys are probably familiar with the concept of RFID tags. these radio frequency identification tags that you put on pallets of product to be able to more easily understand where your pallet of product was and if it was coming into the warehouse or out of the warehouse. This was introduced back in the 2000s, really. It's been a while, RFID tags. But Walmart said, okay, this is such a huge innovation of technology for the industry. It will save us so much money. Walmart, especially back in the year, in the 90s and 2000, Walmart was super dominant, super dominant. They were like the major player, right? This was pre-Amazon days, of course. And so they just threw their weight around and they said, every supplier has to use RFID tags by a certain date. I was at the Kellogg company at the time that they mandated that. So this was definitely in the 90s that they did that. And it basically pissed off everybody because they're like, it's our burden as a company to now adopt the technology that you're saying we need. We agree with the technology, but maybe there's other options or other sources, or why don't we let other RFID tag players get into the field so the cost comes down? Because now we're adding $1 or $2 to every pallet or every box if we want to go down to a box level. So it's not a real fair thing. And then of course, all the other competitors, Target and others that were relatively small compared to Walmart back then, were kind of like, WTF, like, Walmart, you're making this mandate, and this is, now you're basically forcing the whole industry to do this, and it's costly, and it's going to take a lot to do it. And we kind of fumbled through it, meaning Walmart didn't really even know how to use RFID tags efficiently back then to manage their supply chain. So point is, there's been some precedents and some history there. It's like, okay, so Walmart kind of got beat up for that, I think, at the end of the day. So they don't want to go through that experience again of trying to herd cats, or use a stick to get people to comply, because they would tell people you're not going to supply, you won't be a supplier, or you won't be a preferred supplier if you don't have RFID capability by this date. So you have a lot of the industry that just doesn't want to go doesn't want a major player playing that game again. They don't want no one wants to make one company or one government agency to do this, because you could also think, well, why doesn't a group of companies come together like a consortium and under some government agency like the or body like the World Economic Forum or the UN or something, and why isn't it sanctioned by that? You still have, and this is what, David, you were referring to, is, okay, does a fisherman in the Philippines really trust a conglomerate of the biggest companies in the world governed by the World Economic Forum or something, or some other body? And the answer is no. They're worried that somebody ultimately owns this system, and somebody owns the servers and somebody owns the software. And even if they try to say, like, this is the rules in terms of how your data is used, who knows? Do we really think that if Walmart has some foodborne illness and it kills a bunch of consumers in a store, that they're not going to scapegoat and say it was the fishermen in the Philippines that, that didn't do something right that created the foodborne illness? There's just no trust. And I'm not even if you don't think that Walmart would do something like that, it's the perception that they would do something like that. And if members of the supply chain, through the value chain, especially at the source of the supply, the fisherman or the rancher or the person at the mine, if they're skeptical about how the data is going to use, they just won't do it, or they'll just resist it. And if you resist it, the whole model falls apart, because you have to really have 100% engagement and participation, not 100%, but close to it, right? You have to have people wanting to be part of it versus being forced to be a part of it. It's more of a human behavior challenge. And so, in addition to what you said, David, it's, I as a fisherman, or I as a third, somewhere in the middle of the supply chain, maybe the logistics company that gets it from one point to another point before it gets sent overseas on a boat or something. Part of my livelihood is my relationships I have in my supply chain. So by sharing where I'm getting my product from and where I'm delivering it to and how, can sometimes be my whole intellectual property competitive advantage as someone in the supply chain arena, right? So to share that in a system, you really have to trust, how it's going to be used and who's going to use it. And that's another area of trust, whether you think Walmart will point the finger at you if there's a foodborne illness, justly or unjustly, or whether you think I'm going to give Walmart all my secrets of where I get the best price at the best quality, et cetera, in my supply chain. It took me years, if not decades, to build these relationships. So basically the model doesn't work if you think about that. You know, whether you understand supply chains or not, I mean, it's kind of human behavior, right? It's just that whole thing is very hard to do. Scott, you mentioned the scalability. That's actually not an issue at all. I mean, Walmart could have a billion SKUs, you know, just like Amazon does. Computing technology is getting so powerful that maybe was a bigger issue back 20 years ago, but now that's not the issue. It definitely adds complexity, but it's not the issue to have a system that can scale. As a matter of fact, centralized systems scale. I don't think this is a controversial statement. From my vantage point, centralized systems today scale better than decentralized architectures and blockchains. They scale much easier and better, the technology today. So it's actually an advantage to use a centralized system. You almost are disadvantaged on the scale side if you decide to use a blockchain architecture today. So you almost have to do it, not because it's a superior tech, it just has different properties and attributes to it, like transparency and trust, because Walmart doesn't own the server or the software. Okay, so you saw people get very excited back in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, when blockchain architectures were being described to industry, because people started to realize, people that understood this, like I was someone that understood the technology and the business side, and thought, my first inclination was, a system that nobody owns, no one can change the code on, it just executes code based on certain predetermined rules. That might alleviate the issue of, I'm not going to put my system in something that Walmart owns or some government agency owns. So that could solve part of the problem, because now you're not giving your data to someone. You're putting it in a lockbox with certain rules on how it'll be distributed and shared. So that was the first kind of sign of light to a solution. And you saw a lot of blockchain plays in supply chain. I mean, that was probably one of the biggest domains that people started to run to with blockchain, for good reason, you know, for that particular reason, like a decentralized autonomous system that's helping operate some of the very basics around supply chain management. You'd have to do a lot of stuff off chain, because blockchains were not sophisticated supply chain systems. They were basically just record keeping, which is kind of what's needed here. So you'd keep a lot of the processing and a lot of other things off chain, which is fine. You would just take some of the basic fundamentals that would be stored on chain in a very simple way. So this would be, my suggestion was, at a minimum, you could get essentially what a notarized signature is from someone. So you can get a fisherman or the head of the operations that hires the fisherman to actually, if at a minimum, deliberately and explicitly, not implicitly, but explicitly put their signature on something, digital signature on something, to say, I vouch that this is the product I got that meets these standards, and I'm sending it out, and I'm vouching that the way I'm sending it out to my next tier of supply, I'm sending it out this way, meeting these standards. So it's a little bit, it's the simplest form. It's just you putting your word on it, which is now documented and captured. And if you know that your word could come back to you and haunt you if you try to fabricate it, then there'd be a consequence for it. So that was a little bit of, I mean, a lot of companies and a lot of operations were trying to like do crazy things with blockchain. Like, let's put tags on fish, like almost like the RFID model. Like, let's put NFC, near field communication tags, or Bluetooth, type tag. Let's put tags into, let's put literally hardware technology into a fish. And that eventually might be something that happens because of the cost of technology is coming down so much to do that. But I don't think that's ever really going to work. I mean, you could put a tag on a fish, but that fish could have been from a slave labor boat that just pulled up in your side of the ocean and dumped a bunch of slave labor fish into your boat, which happens. Stuff like that happens. So now you spend all this technology. If someone wants to cheat the system, they're going to cheat the system. You can't, at the end of the day, blockchain or no blockchain, or trust or no trust, if someone wants to cheat, it's not that difficult to cheat unless you have spy satellites literally trying to see if, in that example of slave labor boats are pulling up to regular boats and dumping their supply, which partly is what they do. They use satellites to try to figure that stuff out. That's just a cat and mouse game. You're never going to win it. You really got to rethink the whole equation if you're going to solve it. And the whole equation is one part technical, i.e. decentralized architectures that nobody owns. And B is a behavioral science, much more of a behavioral science. So now you're talking about incentive structures. And decentralized architectures, because you can tokenize the economy behind them, you can also start to offer interesting incentive structures that get people willing participants, where people want to participate. Now the cost of cheating is more of an opportunity cost than participating if you're kicked off the chain. So that's an interesting dynamic that's been introduced, and I've done a lot of research in that area, and there's some very interesting behavioral science economics you can put into it, because you have all these new tools. You have decentralized architectures, you have token economics that you can introduce into that model, and some unique things that you can do. However, there's one Achilles heel to that whole master plan that has kind of has been the reason why blockchain architectures have not done that well in reinventing the supply chain, even though there's been so many attempts in the last 6-7 years. Some big projects, providence.org with Fish, a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of smart people working on this. But at the end of the day, there's a little bit of a behavioral science Achilles heel. Can anyone guess what that is? Why, with all that, if you did that perfectly, why there's still a trust issue or something that's just quite not right? Anyone want to take a stab at that? The challenge is, if you're the fishermen's union in the Philippines, or the fishermen for that matter, first of all, you don't really care or understand what a blockchain is. So no, if you tell someone, put your data in here, oh, don't worry, it's a blockchain, nobody owns it, that whole spiel, they're gonna be like, I don't understand what I'm busy fishing here, so leave me alone. Right there, it's not that they're incompetent, but it's not an easy concept for anyone to understand. I'm not being derogatory towards fishermen in Philippines. I think it doesn't matter who you talk to. If you try to explain this to, I've tried to explain this to CEOs, and they don't understand what it is. It's just not necessarily the most easiest thing to understand. So a workers union or consumer advocacy group or workers' rights group or watchdog group is the group that will intervene to explain to the fishermen's union, hey, this is a decentralized architecture, and if you put your data in here, it will be used in this certain way, and it can't be used in any other way. And you can decide to pull your data whenever you want out of it. It's an opt-in model. So you have groups like that will vouch for these blockchain architectures. That's happened already. You've seen that happen, and they've gone out and educated, a fisherman's village to use that example. They've educated them on what is this architecture and the fact that it's decentralized, and therefore people felt comfortable putting their data in. The Achilles heel is that who knows really what the system does other than what someone tells you it does. You have to understand how to read the code to do that. And that could take months. And also there's no repercussions if they tell you it does something and the code actually does something else, and you find out later and you interpret it later after you've been burned that, hey, this is what's happened here. The code is actually didn't do what they told us it was going to do. I'm taking these guys to court. Then a judge has to try to figure out what the code does. And then there's a question was, did you have someone like Henning, or someone who's a step above everybody else in terms of their knowledge of how to program and code in these environments? Was that coder superior to other coders to where even a sophisticated coder couldn't figure out what this master coder did? So it's a mystery what the code actually does versus what someone tells you it's going to do. And that's where I got excited about Lexon, because that is a major Achilles heel. I mean, you can't have 99% trust, or 90% trust, and then there's 10% a complete gap. Like if Walmart wanted to cheat you, they could cheat you because they say, put your data in here. It's on a blockchain architecture. We don't own it. We don't control it. And this is what's going to happen with your data. But unless you have someone go through it with a microscope and look at all the code and what it actually does, you're back to that same game. Do I really trust Walmart? Do I think they might tell me it does this, but actually it does something else? Does Walmart even know? Maybe they hired a developer that built this thing, but some developer decided to make some backdoor in the code to where they get access to this data because they want to monetize it. Who knows, right? Even if it's conspiracy theory, it kills the perception, it kills the trust. So you still have this issue, and that's where I get excited about Lexon as a major need to have, not nice to have, because now you can tell anybody, okay, lawyer at the Fishers advocacy group or the Fishers workers union, read this. This is the code. Now you can tell us in a matter of hours or days if this is playing by the rules that you're recommending to your stakeholders, the fishermen in this village, that yeah, this is exactly what's going to happen if you put your data in here. And so as long as you're comfortable with that, we're good to go. We should use this blockchain and reap some of the upside benefits that come out of the token economics of the whole thing. And I don't mean cryptocurrency token economics. I mean new ways of transferring value through the value chain, so that people at the original beginning of the value chain actually share in some of the upside reward of that value chain being preferred by consumers. So when I get a package at the grocery store and it says, this is organic, no slave labor used, no unethical treatment of workers, no, pesticides, it was at the right temperature and refrigerated throughout its whole journey. We can even tell you who the fisherman was. All of that becomes a reality because the human behavior of the whole supply chain decided to opt in versus opt out or be skeptical or want to cheat the system. So that's where, and quite frankly, when Henning and I met each other, he was working on this. And then after, we both actually lived in the same neighborhood. So as he moved on in his work to build this out, and as I moved on in my endeavors, we continued to collaborate and really focus on this, because that's a real pragmatic use case. And supply chains are big and they're complex, and that's a huge business around supply chains. And I can't think of something different that's been applied in the whole supply chain arena in decades. And we're kind of keep regurgitating and recycling the same ideas. These are now new ideas. Blockchain was phase one, Lexon is phase two. And if you put them together, you have a pretty powerful model in which to, I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet. I just say it's the door opener to the realm of a new supply chain ecosystem and model that's quite different from behavioral science and technical architecture than what anyone's used before. That's why it's so hard for traditional consulting firms to really get their grasp around this, because that's just foreign language to them. That's not how they've dealt with tech and supply chains. And you can take what we just described and bring it to other use cases. But that's a perfect example where Lexon is just not a cool thing to do. Hey, why don't we build the code with Lexon, and so it reads reads like a legal English. Nice to have, not need to have. No, this is need to have. This is the deciding factor of why people will actually use this new model, because that part's not a mystery. And if you put Lexon code on a centralized system, I don't think the model would work. I think it has to be a decentralized system, because Walmart could say, hey, Walmart's issue is not that people can't read the code from a Walmart system. Walmart's issue is it's Walmart. And people don't trust that Western corporate, that they're going to look out for their best interests. And maybe I'm being a little bit too aggressive with Walmart. I don't mean to be, but it's just human behavior, right? It's human perception. So let me just pause there and see if any of you guys have any comments or questions.
Got a whole bunch, so if someone else wants to do it first, but
No, please, David.
so yeah, to me, I'd like to delve into practical details that are required to take what is still quite I mean, if I was to describe this presentation and this argument that you've made, it's really quite subtle and philosophical. So I think I'm asking myself how to make it much more punchy, right? And that's by looking at the detail. So I'm wondering pragmatically what that detail would be. So what I'd love to, it seems to me that there's two areas of being able to read the code as a legal agreement that your community, that your lawyers can understand, and even you can understand, that are advantageous. One is from the customer's point of view, and people who want to know that this, you know, this kind of kite mark that's on the goods, if you like, what it actually means for the obligations that, you know, people have, if you like. And we haven't mentioned that at all. And maybe you think that's not an interesting part of the equation. Just from my point of view right now, I would have thought you could work for, you know, consumer advocacy groups and get them involved. And we talk quite a bit about the suppliers aspect as well. Then I would love to see what those agreements look like, what a chain of these kind of small agreements look like. And I'd like to see, like, you know, here's like 3 of them strung together, and this is, oh, I can read that, and this is how it works, and that's why I can trust it, if you like. So that's 2 things I'd really like to see in a concrete form, what those kind of supply chain contracts look like. That would give me a lot more confidence in it, and I think other people as well. Even if it's there's some aspects that, you know, won't compile straight away to a smart contract. What do they look like? And that's one question, or maybe 2. And the third question is, like, in terms of the psychological incentive, sociological incentive, like, how do we, what does a kind of like a kite mark or something, if you're a supplier, what does it really look like, so that I'm really proud of it, I really want it, I can show it to all sorts of people, and it's immediately in my advantage to show that, because it's kind of this, I don't know, what is it? Is it cool logo? Is it the fact that I can click on that logo and I can see these nice agreements that are in legalese endorsed by these other organizations? And so I want to get it, even if it's not being used. It's just because I can, when I'm trying to get a customer, I can use it. Is there some way that that's there?
Yeah, I mean, on the latter point, David, you'd have to, I don't know if you remember the Betty Housekeeper seal of approval. Remember, that was a thing back in the 80s, in the 70s, where if Betty Housekeeper, or is it Betty? Yeah, Betty Housekeeper. Yeah, if you, I don't know, maybe it's an American thing.
I think it's Betty sounds very American. Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely American thing. There was
back,
yeah, back in the 70s and 80s, and most Americans remember this if you're of that age. There was Betty, what was it called? Betty Housekeeper seal of approval. So this was I think this was a magazine, or I mean, this was back in the 70s and 80s. So magazines were big deals back then. I don't know if it was a TV show, but it was basically a magazine that tried to tell, sorry, good housekeeping seal of approval. Thank you, Jonathan. Where did I come up with Betty? There's a Betty in there somewhere. Good housekeeping was, and Jonathan helped me out here, but I think it was Jonathan put in the chat, Betty Crocker. There we go. Betty Crocker, Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. Thank you, Jonathan, you're a savior. So Betty Crocker was a respected brand, and they had a Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval, which is basically people trusted them to go out and figure out what products were good and what products were bad. You know, in the 70s or 80s, most Americans were just buying, you had the choice of 7 different cereals to buy. That's it, or 5. So if Betty Crocker, Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval, there was literally a stamp that all the brands wanted on their packaging, because the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval was literally a jingle, like, look for the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. So I don't know how that stemmed, if it was a marketing thing that Betty Crocker started, or if it was a legitimate science group behind there actually studying labels. I don't know enough of the details, but all I do remember is my mom saying, look for stuff with the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval on, and you would see commercials all the time advertising that. So that's just psychology, right? That's just getting people to feel more comfortable that someone's actually trying to watch their back. So by having a proof of provenance seal of approval, that's a Lexon proof of provenance seal of approval. That's what I shared with Henning back, that's ultimately when a Lexon brand, the Lexon seal of proof of provenance stamp, which basically says it's not bulletproof, but it's basically saying there's an extra degree of certainty that what you're about to put in your body or put on your clothing, what have you, at a minimum, at least everyone in the supply chain is explicitly saying they didn't break any rules. And at a maximum, there's been some checks and balances to where, because of the incentive structure, there was good participation across the supply chain to get this product to you, and everyone is being very transparent, because there's value that can now be given back to that supply chain as a result to pay for that transparency. For example, what if you could charge, just like you can charge more for organic food? You go to Whole Foods and the organic tomato is 30% higher price than the regular tomato. I think that's not because it costs more completely. I think that's people.
Okay, so, how do you see how let's say I'm a supplier of some chemical to this manufacturing process, let's say the shoe or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the process of me getting that I forgot what we'd call it, that certificate, that
proof of the seal?
Yeah, the CO. And how does someone interact with it? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that the seal can be similar to like a non-fungible token, right? It can be,
yeah.
I have a limited number of seals that I can put onto the chain as a fisherman in exchange for pulling something off the chain like a token. And then the seal goes upstream, and then the brand has to basically put tokens into the chain in order to get that NFT seal that then they can put on their product packaging. And there's, could someone print a label of your seal just like someone could take a copy of an NFT? Yeah, but there's probably ways to validate it. There's probably ways to authenticate it a little bit more. And just the fact that the whole psychology there, it's not a perfect science, but it's definitely a lot better than anything that existed so far. The goal is, how do you get consumers, the fishermen, the Walmart, and everyone totally incentivized to participate in this chain and never do anything that would risk their non-participation? And the fisherman is who you got to think of the most, because Walmart obviously gets upside because people want to buy their product from Walmart because they have more of these seals and this authentication process than Target, which is next door, or Whole Foods. But the big key is the sources of supply and everything in between, because it obviously doesn't go from a fisherman right to the Walmart shelf. It goes through 20 other places. So to get them all to want to participate, you got to think of some token economic strategy that gets value to them for participating that's worth more than the value of them cheating. And that means that to get the seal, Walmart's got to pay for it, which brings value back to the others in the supply chain. So Walmart, you don't get to just capitalize on this and get it and create this brand yourself. You only get this authenticated seal if you decided to buy it off the chain of your suppliers. So there's some interesting dynamics you can put in there.
Yeah. Marcus, this is Inga.
Hi.
Hi. And we talked before on the football and with Pakistan.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then it's the one thing is about the regenerative approach in agriculture into the food. But I also recently seen there is like kind of a full circle or regenerative aspects of fashion industry or fashion products, even sport products. And I've been studying the Caring Group in Paris. They really and this is quite an interesting case. And right now I'm standing in my retail shop with having Icelandic wool blankets and beautiful coats and wool articles. And for example, the case of having regenerative approach from the luxury group, Caring Group, from products from cashmere wool, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different challenge than having a wool blanket from Icelandic, water energized, or the Icelandic quality stuff, and it's a easier product. And then, for example, the purer products in the fashion industry, like silk and cotton, wool, hemp, and also the mix of recycled fibers. But if we start with like very clear products like wool from Iceland, and the welfare of the animals is beautiful, the power of the working product, they're going to be shipped straight to Norway by, we can measure the footprint of that products.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, for example, on wool wear, very high sold in supermarkets, good price point, but the wool comes from South Africa, shipped to China, produced in a China setting, and powered by coal, shipped back to Norway and all the sporting equipment stores for the winter. And they sell it as ethical wool from South Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the value chain is actually through China.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to really cut the crop and really start looking at the regenerative, luxury products, that luxury brands has this luxury stamp like Lexon, and then we also talk about full circle value chain, like what's happening at the end of that life cycles of that product. And fast fashion is more complicated than slow fashion like wool. So how do you see that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The other element that I think is required here, independent of blockchain and independent of Lexon, is the localization of supply chains, which I think is a trend that you're going to see more and more of. And just to be sustainable, right? Like, why ship product through 20 different places all over the world to get it when you could have got it from point A to point Z much quicker or much more direct and just jumped all those steps. So there's a company that I'm working with now called Blend Hub, BLENDHUB. Henrik is the founder and executive that runs it. It's a pretty big operation now. I'm helping them on a whole initiative around supply chains, and actually doing a lot with them around virtual reality, because that's a big field of mine that I help companies develop virtual reality simulations of their operations for a variety of use cases. But what Blend Hub is doing, and they're getting a lot of accolades, I think Deloitte did a study on them and gave them some accolades, et cetera, is they're basically saying, why are we, now that we can put manufacturing in a box, to build a big factory like the Kellogg Company with a big supply chain operation, used to be something you had to be a big company like the Kellogg Company to do. Multi-billion-dollar company. I think Kellogg's, when I was there, they were a $14 billion company. Who knows what they are now? I think they've made some acquisitions, but the point is, and that's not even that big in terms, Procter & Gamble is what, hundreds of billions of dollars, Unilever, et cetera. So one of the competitive advantages they have is the infrastructure, the capital intensive infrastructure. What Blend Hub has realized is that with the democratization of technology, like your computer that now is your phone, factories and production facilities have gone through that as well, especially with 3D printing and additive manufacturing, which I do a lot of work in that space as well. So long story short, what Blend Hub does is they figured out how to take a miniature factory of a food processing plant, the quality of which is similar to the quality of, big food companies, and put it right next to the farm. If you have a warehouse that's 200 meters, they can transform you into a factory. So you have product coming out of the earth that immediately gets processed into healthy food using the local resources, and then shipped, comes out the back end of the factory, and then a drone or a guy or a person on a bike or a truck takes it to the local village or the local community. And so that's localized supply chains. And so part of it is the utopia here is localized supply chains to get rid of all that crap you were just referring to, Inger, of like shipping stuff all around the world and it getting all complex. Simplify the supply chain. Then with that simple supply chain, put a decentralized architecture with Lexon, and then you're in this utopia situation, because first of all, a lot of the complexity that you're never going to fix with, I mean, there's supply chains that are so complicated. I don't care if you throw Lexon transparent code and blockchains at it, you're definitely going to move the needle. It's definitely going to help. But did you solve the whole problem where everything you buy you can trust from that source? No, the supply chain is just too complex, and it's also very dynamic. They change a lot too, right? Suppliers change a lot, sometimes daily, depending on the price, right? So to really get to it, and I say utopia for a variety of reasons, to get to a very sustainable solution, to get a very cost-effective solution, to get a solution that values and rewards the local farmer, the local producers, who really are the beginning of the value chain. Look at these localized food productions. The best example I can see of that is what BlendHub is doing, trying to do globally now. It's pretty amazing work that they're doing. And they have very much a social mission as well as a commercial mission. But I think that's a big risk for some of your bigger players, because as a consumer, I'm clearly going to buy something that's from a local, that my local community is producing, versus getting shipped to me halfway around the world from a big brand like Kellogg's. Now, the issue is, and this is again where Lexon comes in and blockchain comes in, the issue is I might still buy the Kellogg's cereal, even though I heard this local production by BlendHub in my backyard producing, here in the community with the farmers. Why? Because I grew up buying the Kellogg brand and I trust it. And they tell me they don't use slave labor, and they tell me it's organic, and they tell me I'm not going to, I'm allergic to peanuts and this product doesn't contain peanuts, and I'm not going to eat something and find out it has peanuts in it. It was mixed with peanuts in the supply chain. I trust Kellogg's for that. Even though I've seen them not adhere to that 100% over the decades, they do a pretty good job because their brand is at risk. Their whole livelihood's at risk if they screw that up. So that's why I want to buy that brand. That's just marketing. My degree is actually in marketing, and that's what happens. The brand equity of a brand like Kellogg's is an asset. It can also become a liability, by the way, but it's been an asset for decades, for centuries. I mean, Kellogg Company is over 100 years old because people know you're getting something of a certain quality. So if I introduce this local model like BlendHub's doing, their Achilles heel is the local villager says, I don't know, I'm seeing all these white label products pop up in the supermarket or at a local food market, and they're all branded and they look professionally produced, but I don't really know who these producers are because it's new. And maybe I'm reading in the local news or people are telling me, no, this is from a local farmer co-op operation that's using a factory that we built here. Okay, it might take a while before I decide to adopt and start purchasing from that new brand that I found, because I just don't know that brand. And as a consumer, no one's telling me, even if people try to educate me about blockchain architecture, I mean, none of that matters to me. I just know the Kellogg brand I trust. However, if when I buy that product, the label shows me a lot of the details of where that product was sourced from, and Kellogg's can't do that, but this local thing can, and you can see it literally came 2 days ago from the ground, and you have more transparency on the label. I call it a trust label, not just a nutrition label, but you have a trust label on the product. That I think would be the human behavior side that would get a consumer to feel more prone to purchase that product and adopt that product sooner and forego the trusted brand that they've been buying for years, to the point where the Kellogg brand might become a liability, not an asset, because that's a signal that this was shipped all over the world, wasn't very sustainable, and there's a lot of problems that could have occurred because it's such a complex supply chain. But now the local brands actually become more interesting. So, and I think, David, you're right. I mean, so I wouldn't say it's theoretical. I mean, I'm in this space. I don't think what I'm saying is I think I've done enough hands-on implementations and studies and actual execution of this stuff to know that there's a philosophical notion here, which is that it's a behavioral science. It's not just a technical complexity. It's just not throwing tech at it. There's a behavioral side to it, but that's not a that's not a theory, that's fact. I mean, that's kind of why supply chains, because we've always had tech, and we've got great centralized tech that we can use. That's not it.
What would you consider an ideal scenario pilot? What sort of thing would make an ideal pilot to demonstrate this?
Yeah, well, Henning and I are working on a pilot right now with Lexon, which is with BlendHub. You know, the guys at BlendHub, real good guys, are all out of Europe, Sweden, Germany, I think, UK. I mean, if you look up blendhub.com, really great group, real professional group. Henrik put a lot of his own family money into the business. It's always good when you see a founder that's contributing to the mission and the vision. And we're doing a pilot. Actually, Henning and I are meeting with them in April, and we're actually giving them a statement of work this week, because we shared with them. This is a client I'm doing another project with. I'm doing some virtual reality work with. But when we started talking about this, and they saw that I know a lot about food, you know, for my whole, not just the Kellogg company, but most of my career, I've been worked in a lot of different sectors, but I've done quite a bit with consumer product goods and retail companies. You know, working with the CEOs of many Fortune 500 companies on these topics. So Henning and I are giving a statement of work to BlendHub to say, how about we just do some proof of concept design first? Let's not build anything, but let us take your BlendHub model where they're doing these localized food production sources already, which is a great opportunity to do a Lexon proof of concept, because we're not talking about a huge complex supply chain that we have to deal with some corporate infrastructure and deal with, you know, all these levels of some big company to prove this and to prove that while we're doing some pilot. I don't want to get into that mess. So this is BlendHub's the perfect partner to go with. They'll compensate Henning and team and the Lexon team for actually thinking through this. Some of you may even be, I mean, some people from this community might even be staffed on that project. If you're interested, you should let me and Henning know, because we're going to design it for them. We're going to, you know, and it's new territory. So it's not like we have to have a cookie cutter solution. We're going to do some real consulting and advisory work to figure out, here's your operation BlendHub. If the goal is to print out a nutrition label on the product, but also a trust label, what do we want that to look like, and how will this whole thing happen and work? And how do we then get that adopted by a community? And so that's what we're in the midst now of putting together a first phase of a design phase, a design sprint, I'd call it, to help this company think that through. And then if they're like, I love this plan, let's implement it, then, you know, Lexon will have its first commercial, not first, but one of hopefully several commercial use cases where you're showing real value from the code being used in a real pragmatic situation. I know it's top of the hour.
Yeah.
I know it's top of was there one last question from, I think you said that.
Yeah. Hi, Marcus. Thanks for coming on to talk about supply chain side. So I'm a noob and I'm a finance major and I have interest in the security side of things. And I've worked closely with Scott in the past. So I know you mentioned Walmart and reference to readability of blockchain code and systems. So I was just wondering where you would draw the line between the security aspect of the blockchain ledger system and the technological proficient with the computers and code running the systems. So I know you mentioned tokenomics strategy as well. So are there any other strategies you would consider as factors to draw the line between the security and technological side?
You know, on the security side with supply chains, I actually feel like, I mean, a centralized system can have great security too. I don't think we're going to have people trying to steal data from the system like you would in other systems. I mean, I guess you would, but I don't know if it's security from that standpoint. I think it's more the trust factor, like we were talking about, which is my security is I know that Walmart can never take this data and use it in a way that I didn't allow them to use it. That's the security I want. Not that someone's going to hack this system and go figure out who my suppliers are. Although I don't know enough about food security and hacking in that space. I'd have to ask my good friend Mark Goodman, who's the futurist for the FBI. He wrote the book Future Crimes. He's a very good friend of mine. He would be able to answer that question for me. Is like, are people trying to hack into centralized systems to figure out where these suppliers are getting their supply from? I'm sure there's some of that. I don't know if it's a huge black market for that though. The security I think is more important is people not wanting to kingmake or trust everybody in the supply chain, especially. And I don't mean this. I mean, unfortunately, this conversation sounds like I'm picking on Walmart. I'm using them more of as an analogy of a big Western corporate or a big corporate that maybe people should trust Walmart more. I'm not even passing judgment, but they just don't for a variety of reasons. Not everyone will, and probably some good reasons and some reasons that are hyped. But the security is that this system will not do things it's not programmed to do, and no one can change that.
Yeah, I mean, if there are any outside sources, but I know tokenomics would definitely help, like, be more transparent about the fact that everyone is owning the system in terms of corporations.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, no, that's an interesting. I'm not even claiming. And David, to some of your comments, I haven't figured all this out yet, but I definitely think there's just a new tool set. And I've been dealing in this space for a long time, and nothing changes. And consultants get paid again and again and again to regurgitate and recycle the same problems and come out with the same reports to fix something that everyone forgot they wrote that same report 10 years ago. So what's different is what I look at is, well, what's different? What's different is people trust people less, not more. And as the supply chains get more complex, so the trust factor is even worse. Also, because of the headlines you see, horse meat ending up in hamburgers at a Costco store or what have you, or IKEA, hot dogs coming with horse meat in it, whatever it is. You see all these headlines. So things have gotten worse, not better. And from a trust perspective, that's one thing that's different. Supply chains have gotten more complex. That's another thing that's different. And the only thing that's different is there's a new decentralized architecture and code that reads like English.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I read an article about how seafood was being labeled being mislabeled as of recently. So that's definitely an issue in the seafood industry.
Yeah, and if you start looking into it, you'll see there's tons of this stuff going on. I mean, it's actually a big issue. If you start looking into mislabeling and all that stuff, I mean, it's crazy. So this is there's tools now, there's new tools being introduced into a new environment that I think somehow if you stir that pot a little bit, and that's what we want to do with this proof of concept we're going to do, is try to take a very simple example, like with Blend Hub localized production, and actually just show that the tech works, and what I want to do is have a model where everyone in the value chain, from the fisherman to the consumer to the manufacturer, everyone's like, this is a model that works for all of us. This is one that when we all participate and play by the rules, we float all boats. We all benefit. Consumers will demand this. And then that upside is shared back to the whole chain. I've come up with a concept that I share this. Some of what I'm sharing with you is some of the intellectual property that I've designed and worked on. I'm not being territorial here. I'm just saying it as a matter of fact. I mean, it's stuff that I've spent some of my life working on, but this one concept that I've come up with, which is, confidentially, the right way to think about this is tip your waiter, and then tip your supplier, tip your farmer. So you can use blockchains to take the token economics all the way from the source of supply. When you tip your waiter, you could also see a line on there that says tip your farmer, or tip your fisherman for that fish that's on your plate that you're about to eat. And that's how you get into some interesting ways that you can share the economics back with the supply chain. And you can only do that
it's more on the transaction side.
Yeah, and you can really only do that with a blockchain architecture. I mean, it's really conducive. Blockchains are not good at a lot of things. They're pretty good at moving tokens around, right? So, hey, I know we're over the time, but thank you, everyone. Hopefully that was informative, if not interesting, or both.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus, for being with us today. I really appreciate your time. For everyone else, I know, Jonathan, you didn't get to ask your last question. Maybe you can hop into Telegram, ask it there. And then thank you everyone for coming this week. In a few weeks, we'll be going over the basics of smart contracts. We're just going to go all the way back to the beginning of Ethereum and the whole concept of smart contracts and what that's about. And then keep in touch with us on social and you'll know when the next events are. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
again,
Thanks for the
Marcus.
questions. Yeah, thank you. Bye, guys.